Martyr stories are like mushrooms. You go away and you come back and the room was dark and suddenly you have a whole lot of mushrooms. And that's what happens with martyrdom stories, that there's something happens and then the stories just multiply. The Socrates legend, that legend definitely affects how Christians tell stories about their martyrs. So if we're talking about accounts written in the city of Rome in the 2nd century, all of those figures are presented as kind of these philosopher types. You can see the influence of the Socrates legend in many early Christian martyrdom accounts. That kind of, even like a mythological paradigm, think Achilles choosing death and glory over a long life and comfort, or Iphigenia, the daughter of Agamemnon, who sacrificed before the Trojan War. All of these countless examples, which would flourish in a culture where people die pretty young. These kind of shape what it means to die a good death. And with the back ends, there are a lot of women involved. It sounds like orgies, there's definitely partying. And so you can see a bunch of women running around, participating in what kind of looks like an ancient Burning Man every weekend is not really something that they like. No one else has an issue with this. And now this is this new superstition and they refuse to participate in this. And from the Roman perspective, they're like, we're not stopping you from being Christian. Just come do this one thing. You can do your weird Jesus stuff, but just come do this one thing and we're good.
Is there any truth to the Celsus Talmud story about Pantera?
And I'm gonna say there's a reason. Celsus has a good reason to think that. Let's just say that, a good historical reason.
My guest today, one of the great scholars of our time, Dr. Candida Moss, a graduate from Oxford and Yale University, specializing in the study of the New Testament and early Christianity. Her controversial book, The Myth of Persecution: How Early Christians Invented a Story of Martyrdom, argues that the stories of early Christian martyrdom have been altered, edited, and shaped by later generations of Christians, and none of them are completely historically accurate. We're going to talk about that and a lot more. And also, there is a link in the description for a Bible conference led by Dr. Bart Ehrman, and Candida Moss is going to be there giving her own lecture on the topic of the family of Jesus, the historical family, and who Jesus' father might or might have not been. If you use the link in the description, you'll be helping out the channel. And there's tons of scholars along with Dr. Moss, like Mark Goodacre, Robyn Walsh, and Dr. James Tabor, as well as many others. Once again, the link is in the description. It is a conference about new insights into the New Testament. And welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And as you just saw with that intro, I am with one of our great scholars of our time who will be joining the conference with Bart Ehrman called New Insights into the New Testament, Candida Moss. Thank you for joining me today. How are you doing?
Thanks so much for having me. I'm doing great, especially after that intro. One of the great, I'll take that. Thank you.
For sure. You and I were just discussing real quick. I just want to bring this up for the people who might not know. Quite a few years ago, you were on the O'Reilly Factor with Bill O'Reilly, and it was so legendary that I just wanted to show a quick little highlight of that real quick.
This woman, Dr. Candida Moss, who teaches theology at Notre Dame, says that Jesus was a socialist and was disappointed in me for not highlighting his politics. Dr. Moss writes, quote, "There's no mention of the free health care offered by Jesus and his followers or the insistence that the wealthy give away their possessions," unquote. Here now is Dr. Moss, who herself has a book out called The Myth of Persecution: How Early Christians Invented a Story of Martyrdom. So, Doctor, with all due respect, Jesus was not a socialist. He stayed out of politics. You know that. He wasn't a socialist.
The first is that I think that omitting the social teachings of Jesus and the most consistent social teaching of the New Testament, that the wealthy give away their possessions in order to help the poor, I think that's an oversight. Jesus says very clearly, Bill, and we have to agree on this,
Right.
that in order to go to heaven, you must give away your possessions.
Oh, come on. Then there's nobody in heaven. There's nobody there. He's all by himself.
A rich man is condemned to hell merely for not giving away his possessions. He keeps the rest of the commandments.
No, that's not true.
No,
it's absolutely false. It's a misreading of the Gospels.
It's not a misreading.
What Jesus said, and now I'm getting into theology, and I don't want to do that because that's not what I'm a book about, but I have to do it. What Jesus says is that you have an obligation to help the poor. All right. And that if you are ruled by your possessions, and 2 weeks ago, the gospel dealt with this. If you are ruled by it, if that's what rules you, all right, that's your priority, then you're not going to gain the kingdom of heaven. But he didn't say you got to sell everything, because then you're going to hell, I'm going to hell, and everybody watching going to hell.
He says, blessed are the poor, for they shall inherit the kingdom of God.
No. You're taking it literally when these are parables.
I think in your book that you do not contribute a sustained historical methodology, and you misrepresent and cherry pick the facts. And I think that you fail to recognize just how intrinsic to Jesus' message care for the poor, the sick, and the needy is.
All right.
So yeah, that was amazing. I think you made a good point about methodology. I don't think he was very happy about that, but it was a good thing. And I noticed that some of the early Christians, like there's a group called the Carpocratians, who literally lived what the book of Acts says. They gave up their possessions and they lived in a communal society. Mm-hmm. So not only does the text is talking about, giving up your possessions and living equally amongst each other, but also we have evidence that early Christians themselves were doing that.
Yeah, that's right. And I will tell you, seeing as you just mentioned the show, in the show, what I said to him was that Jesus had to give up. He said he had to give up your money if you wanted to go to heaven, and that blessed are the poor. And when we were actually filming, Bill O'Reilly stops, looks up at the camera and says, "That's not in the Bible." And I'm sitting there with my jaw sort of on the table, just looking at him. And I didn't say, yes, it is. I just kind of was staring at him like, wow, this is wrong. And oddly, that didn't actually make it into the broadcast, because someone fact checked him between recording at 4 p.m. and then it airing at 8 or 9, whenever that was. Yeah.
They clipped that part out. That's funny. And not only that, also in one of the parables, Jesus is talking about how there's 2 workers in the field, and then one of them's complaining because he thinks he should have got paid more than the other one. And I'm thinking to myself, that kind of is an argument right there for equal pay.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, like, the message of embracing poverty and sort of communal living and caring for the poor, that's the most consistent message you have in the New Testament, maybe the Bible, because it's certainly in the prophets as well. And when you think about how many disagreements there are in the New Testament, there are many places where we might say there are contradictions. This really consistent ethic of care for the poor, it's stunning. It's not uniquely Christian, but it's an amazing thing to kind of put to one side in pursuit of, capitalist Jesus who doesn't want you to pay your taxes for wherever that book was supposed to be taking us.
Yeah, I just want to say one more thing about the Jesus and his ideology before I go on to martyrdoms, and that's Bill O'Reilly seemed really, really upset about Rich not making it into heaven. Like, did he feel? It almost felt like, and I'm not going to try to psychoanalyze him, but it's almost like, is he personally like not okay with that? Is there something that I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there.
Well, I mean, he's a wealthy man, and I don't
very
think
wealthy
people,
man, very wealthy.
And there's sort of like some conflict there between Christianity and kind of the capitalistic principles that animate just even the American dream. Work hard, make money, good for you, right? The idea that you don't have to give that money away is sort of antithetical to that sort of American capitalistic dream, which is just fine. But you could see why Bill O'Reilly himself would be concerned about that. And often when you talk to Christians, when I talk to other Christians, I should say, as I was raised Roman Catholic, about this, they're like, oh, but they just mean charity. And you got to bear in mind, this is not a Christian society. If it had been a Christian society, it would have been a little different.
Good point.
So yeah, he didn't seem a fan, but I think that was a question of personal interest.
Well, it was a legendary interview, so I have to thank you for that.
Thank you.
So I want to ask you about your work on the persecution. You wrote a book called The Myth of Persecution, and there's another book as well that you wrote about something to do with other Jesuses. Like, the title's not in front of me right now.
Yeah, so I wrote 3 books. Other Christ is the one you mean. That was based on my dissertation. I won some prizes for it. Then I wrote a book called Ancient Christian Martyrdom, which is like my history of martyrdom. And then I wrote Myth of Persecution, which I think is the book that I'm most well known for. Yeah. If I'd known that, I might have done things differently.
Yeah, so you've really, really looked at this martyrdom history and what it is, what it means to Christianity. My first question is, so I was a Christian, and we were all under the impression of, Jesus lived in the first century, and for the next 2-3 centuries before, we'll say Constantine, just for this, whatever, I'll just say Constantine, but Constantine, Theodosia, that area, the 4th century. Before that, for that 2 centuries in the middle, Christians were badly getting persecuted. They were getting blamed for fires at Rome. They were being burned at the stake and crucified. What would you say about that, the idea of that being the case?
Well, if the image you have is the image that you just described, that I also have, I remember being in school in England. I went actually to a Christian school, and I remember asking the teacher, how do we know that what the apostles told people was true? And they said, well, why would the apostles have been willing to die for Jesus's message if it wasn't true? And at the time, because I was 11, that seemed like a really good response. I'm like, yeah, you're right. And then of course I realized people will die for a lot of things. And then I saw into the history, and I realized they may not have had a choice. It may not have been this thing that they chose to do, which seemed instrumental to the truth claims. If that's the image you have, the image I had, the image you had, that's just wrong. That's demonstrably wrong, because Christians weren't constantly under attack. There was a period of 2 years when, yes, it was pretty intense, especially if you lived in Turkey, if you lived in Caesarea, if you lived maybe in Alexandria in North Africa. But if you lived in France, even then you were fine. But if what people have in their mind is this period, this 200-300 year period of intense, relentless persecution that demonstrates the essential truth of the Christian message, because who would die for something if it wasn't true? That period of constant persecution, that's just not accurate. It doesn't seem like Romans even knew who Christians were until the turn of the 2nd century.
That brings me to my next question, is because we have this source from Pliny the Younger. He's writing a letter to Trajan, and it's kind of related to persecution, because he's asking them, what should we do with these Christians? And then, if I'm not mistaken, Trajan kind of just says, hey, leave them alone. So would you think it's safe to say that this kind of goes against the idea of them especially being blamed for the fire by Nero? I mean, don't you think this would be, Pliny the Younger wouldn't be asking about these brand new people that he's never heard of if this was already the case? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's exactly right. If Nero had persecuted Christians, then you wouldn't find in 110, you wouldn't find Trajan and Pliny having a conversation in a region of the Roman Empire that had a higher proportion of Christians. They wouldn't be having a conversation about what to do with them. And Pliny wouldn't tell Trajan, so I took these Christians, these 2 enslaved Christian women, and I tortured them to find out what Christians are really doing. And they seem kind of harmless. If Christians had been persecuted for, let's say, about 50 years by then, there would have been established protocols. Romans love bureaucracy. They already would have ascertained what it is Christians do. And so it just seems to me impossible that there was any 1st century persecution if in 110 a Roman governor and an emperor don't even really know much about them.
Yeah, it seems like in this second decade of the 2nd century, this is when the Christians are starting to show up in the sources, and people are starting to become aware of them. You mentioned there was a 2-year period where persecution really was bad. Which period is that, and how bad was it?
That's a lot later. That's 303 to 305.
Well, that's a lot later.
Yeah, a lot later. And you'll notice, if we're talking about 303 to 305, but people who understandably wouldn't know, we're within a decade of Constantine taking over. So Diocletian, actually remarkable Roman emperor from the perspective of the Romans,
Right.
he has 4 edicts that only universally enforced throughout the Roman Empire. Only the first 2 are universally enforced. The first one is a demand that Christian buildings and books be destroyed. Now, the first building to become a victim of this persecution is a church that was constructed catty corner across the street from an imperial palace. So what does this tell us? It tells us that up until then, Christians are not hiding, right? They're not hiding. They're building churches right next door to the emperor's summer home, you know?
Yeah.
And the second edict was actually an amnesty. Said it's okay, we're not going to seek you out, but if your leaders would come forward and they would put some incense as a display of loyalty to the emperor, because, you know, bear in mind, Christians are talking about how they have their own emperor, Christ, and he's the emperor of the universe. And to Romans, they're like, could you not use that word? You know, it sounds like treason to them. And then the third and fourth edict, they were certainly worse, but they were only implemented for a very short period of time, and mostly in what is modern-day Turkey, what is the modern-day Holy Land, Syria, that region. And so was it bad? It was probably pretty bad for a period of a few months in 305. And after that, it wasn't that bad, which isn't to say that people dying is okay. That's not okay. None of what the Romans did is okay by modern standards, right? They committed genocide in France. You know, you can be thrown off a rock and killed for writing a satirical song. These are not people that, you know, we would let run our country. But that doesn't mean that they were doing what Christians have traditionally said they were doing. And they weren't seeking out Christians. And I think your point about the Emperor Trajan being like, just leave them alone, is a really important one. We have several stories of Roman governors being like, just go away. I don't want to kill you, just leave.
That makes a lot of sense.
It's a lot of work.
Yeah, you don't, like, who really wants to do that? Or, like, you know, they're still human beings at the end of the day. Now, John Kloppenborg's book shows us that there was these Christian ecclesias, these what do you call them? These groups,
voluntary associations.
There we go. That's the word. And he shows a lot of evidence that, you know, they were like unions. They were like linking together people with different trades. The lumber union, I'm calling it union, but they call it something. They called it ecclesia. But it would be like a modern union where these trades got together and they grouped together, and these were Christian groups. So I'm like, wait a minute, if they're not hiding, they're out there in the public, proud to be part of this ecclesia. And he also points out that even pagans were going to the Christians to get their loved ones buried in these catacombs that the Christians were sort of like operating in. That was like sort of like what they were known for. So that sort of tells us a whole different image of what was going on. Do you think, I mean, are the Christians accepted, or is it like maybe they're a little bit looked at as the other, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I love that you brought up this book. I love this book. It's a great book. And just for your information, there'll be a book coming out, I think in like about a year, from Yale by the classicist Sarah Bond. And I think it's about exactly that, about unions in the Roman Empire. She's a public intellectual. You should talk to her. And she has a chapter that she gave me to read on exactly this. And one of the things I learned from reading her whole book is that Roman leaders, not just emperors, even just the Roman Senate, they don't like unions. They don't like these clubs. So these clubs that Christians were involved in, it's not just Christians doing these like labor unions. There are a bunch of them, a bunch of pagan labor unions too. And Roman authorities don't like them. They're a problem because historically they're linked to uprisings. Often they supply military support in periods of sort of turbulence. And Christians are just like that, another union. And in fact, in the Pliny Trajan correspondence, what we see is in all of the correspondence, not just in the letters about Christians, we see that actually nighttime meetings for these clubs had already been outlawed. They get into like these messy riots all the time. And so authorities don't like them. That's a lot to clamp down on. And the only unions that they would even tolerate would be sort of a bread union. So if you're involved in the bread, if you're a baker's, they'll tolerate you. They'll tolerate expat Roman citizens. They tolerated Jews forming these associations, but they're very, very skeptical of them. So here you have Christians. They're meeting at night. They're referring to one another as brother and sister. This I'm going to talk about for the conference. I'm going to talk about that family language in Christianity. They have this, but to people who don't understand Christianity, you have a bunch of people referring to one another as brother and sister. They're talking about eating the body of Christ and drinking blood. And this sounds super sketch already, right? They come from sort of lower status groups. A lot of them are enslaved. They're from these kinds of groups of sort of weavers or tradespeople that, elites don't really like and are suspicious about. And they represent a kind of power that Romans don't like anyway. They don't need more of these people. And Pliny says, this idea seems to be spreading. And as a result, all of the money I poured into a local temple isn't bearing any fruit because people aren't going to the temples. They're not buying animals to be sacrificed there. This is a big economic problem for me. And so I think that the Romans don't really like Christians because they look like a trade union, and a trade union that interferes with the local economy. And
Wow.
That's not good.
That made a lot of sense. And you just reminded me of a story that Livy tells us about these Bacchants in Italy that were they were like living out in the wilderness, not in the city, and they had like women like running, like they were like having high priestesses, and it was like a very egalitarian countercultural movement, and they got banned from the Romans. There was an edict, I think it's like 204 or something. Something I can put in the comments about what the real date was, but it looks a lot like a persecution happening. Like these Bacchants, they're out in the wilderness, they're having orgies, they're up to no good, and it's like it makes you wonder: is this just because the status of Roman imperial cult, or whatever city you're in, like they have their own like state priesthood, and if something's like at odds with that, then you're just gonna that's just kind of what happens, maybe?
Yeah, partly, definitely. Like the Bacchants are a great comparante here, because here you have another group of people being targeted not for what they believe. So if you think that Christians were targeted because of what they believed, that's not it at all. No one cares what Christians believe. They care about how they're acting and how they're affecting society. And with the Bacchants, there are a lot of women involved. It sounds like orgies. There's definitely partying. Romans are known for like grounding their entire society in the household. And women's chastity is a big deal. The Emperor Augustus makes adultery punishable by death and exile. And so you can see a bunch of women running around participating in what kind of looks like an ancient Burning Man every weekend is not really something that they like. So there's that part of it, not liking that. So far as the imperial cult goes, it was offensive to Roman leaders that Christians wouldn't participate in the Roman cult, because for them, it's not really a religious thing. It's a sort of entanglement of political allegiance, social loyalty. And to them, they're like, it's some grains of incense. What is your problem? No one else has an issue with this. And now this is this new superstition, and they refuse to participate in this. And from the Roman perspective, they're like, we're not stopping you from being Christian. Just come do this one thing. You can do your weird Jesus stuff, but just come do this one thing and we're good.
Right.
And when Christians said no, they were like, what is your problem with the emperor? And that starts to them to feel like treason. And that's not a thing you allow to flourish. You don't wait and see on treason.
Good point. Wow, that was great. Now, I do want to, because when we look at some of the sources about like Jews in the Roman Empire, there is some evidence that they were treated pretty roughly. One of the sources being Philo, where he tells us about I think it's like a letter to some he's writing to some guy, a Roman guy, and he's basically comparing Augustus and how great he was to Caligula and how bad Caligula is, and he's telling about how Caligula is like just like going off on them just for not kneeling to him or calling him worshiping him as a god. And then I think there's some other sources of them getting like kicked out of Rome in certain years.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think this is sort of setting up the stage for Christians that not like steal that, but like sort of like borrow that identity as like, and we're like kind of outcasted, like, we're part of the Jewish religion, basically.
Yeah, partly. I don't think Romans saw Christians as a kind of Jew and therefore we should treat them badly. Certainly, there were some allowances made for Jews. There would be certain kinds of skirmishes where Romans would learn, oh, they will die for this. It's becoming a problem. We don't want an uprising. So there are places where Romans back down. And there are places where they had had enough and they would clamp down. So they, like exactly as you said, they exiled them from the city of Rome. There was a lot happening in Alexandria. We have some court proceedings there as well. Romans don't like that. For Christians, I think it's a combination of things. It's certainly there's this idea of like the sort of holy sufferer that's in Judaism. You find it with the suffering servant of Isaiah. You find it in the myths of the Maccabean martyrs. But you also find it just in that Jesus story. If Christianity has a moment of genius, it's this. Everybody already thought that if you were doing well, it's because your gods were powerful and you were pleasing your gods. What Christianity folds into that is that looking at Jesus and the end that he met, which really should have been the end of the Jesus movement. They should have been done then. This idea that if you're successful, that's God loving you. But also if you're persecuted, that's God loving you because God allows his most righteous people to be persecuted. See exhibit A here, Jesus. And this allows Christianity to occupy kind of both ends of a rhetorical spectrum. Persecution, good. Powerful, good. And that means that there's no way to say to a Christian, don't you think that the fact that this is happening to you is a sign that maybe you're doing something wrong? You can't say that in Christianity. You are justified no matter what. And that is a moment of genius, really.
Wow, that's fascinating. Now, I recently found out that it wasn't just Socrates that was at odds with the religious leaders of Athens, but also Aristotle and a couple other of these Athenian academy people. One of the sources says that Aristotle had to flee and then he committed suicide. And like so, I wonder. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is you have the prophets in the Old Testament. You have they're always at odds with the kings or whatever. And do you think it's like it's becoming a cultural thing for like the truth to be against the status quo, and the Christians are sort of just like doing kind of what everyone else is. I don't know. I said like doing what everyone else is doing, but the Christians sort of take on that identity as well.
Yeah. Here's what I say about it. So the Socrates legend, definitely sort of like put together from stories by Xenophon and Plato. That legend definitely affects how Christians tell stories about their martyrs. So if we're talking about accounts written in the city of Rome in the 2nd century, all of those figures are presented as kind of these philosopher types. You can see the influence of the Socrates legend in many early Christian martyrdom accounts. That doesn't necessarily mean that those people didn't die. It just means that their story is told using this framework of the death of a philosopher. And I think what we have is a lot of different kind of cultural paradigms, a philosophical paradigm, a Jewish paradigm, that kind of, even like a mythological paradigm, think Achilles choosing death and glory over a long life and comfort, or Iphigenia, the daughter of Agamemnon, who sacrificed before the Trojan War. All of these countless examples, which would flourish in a culture where people die pretty young and people can die of just about anything all the time. And so all of these kind of cultural models of a meaningful death, which always involves sort of dying young or dying unnecessarily, these kind of shape what it means to die a good death. And so for early Christians, it was pretty natural to think that you might have a deity or you might have a cause that would demand that you die for it. Christians aren't like super special in this regard. There are all kinds of things that they're taking on in their stories.
Wow. Now I want to ask you about Paul and Peter. When are these legends first showing up in the sources? About let's start with Paul, since he's earlier. Is there evidence early on that Paul was killed? Was he crucified? What do you think? What are your thoughts on what happened to Paul? Or do we just not know?
Well, so, it's funny you say Paul's earlier. I know exactly what you mean. His writings are earlier. But the legend, the first reference to his death is actually to both Peter and Paul. It's in a text known as First Clement. It's a letter written by the inhabitants of Rome to people in Corinth. And it's attributed to Clement of Rome, who was supposed to be an early pope. But we don't really know that. And it refers to the deaths of Peter and Paul. I always kind of like, when we're talking about popes, it's important to tell you whether or not we're really talking about a person being involved here. So Peter and Paul, according to that text, died because of jealousy. And the word there implies kind of intra-ecclesial jealousy. Like there are people in the community who don't like them. And so for whatever reason, they end up dying. No reference to how they died, no reference to Nero, no reference to a fire of Rome, nothing. That's all we know. That's it. And then in the 2nd century, we start to get martyrdom accounts written for both Peter and Paul. With Paul, the martyrdom legend says that he was beheaded. And after he was beheaded, which you would expect because he's allegedly a citizen, I have some questions about whether or not that's accurate, but Acts says he was a citizen. And so you can imagine someone writing a story after Acts would have him be beheaded because Acts had said he was a citizen. So he's beheaded and milk apparently sputs out of his neck after he's beheaded. So that's our Paul legend.
Is there any reason why they would write that with milk? Or does anyone have any thoughts on that? Or
Yeah. So milk is associated in Greek philosophy with education, and Paul uses that image himself. He talks about before you have meat, you have milk. It's like your preface to like the real meat of heart of the subject. We do it in English too, like the meat of the matter or something.
Right.
So it's about education. Peter is allegedly crucified upside down. Our earliest version of the story does say he was crucified upside down. In the case of Peter, this is because he's been sort of making a scene in the city of Rome, getting into trouble there. He's been telling people to be celibate, and this just never goes over well. In fact, this is a theme in all of the martyrdom accounts of apostles. They go around telling wealthy women to stop having sex with their husbands, and their husbands, who happen to be some of the most powerful men in the city, they obviously have those men's attention now. So, but that's not, I believe in Christ, that's, I'm telling your wife not to have sex with you, and now I, an impoverished fisherman, wind up in your courtroom. And stunningly, they're unimpressed by Peter in this context. So Peter does get crucified upside down in a late 2nd century story. But if you heard at some point in your education or in church that was because he was too humble to die the way Jesus died, that is not what the text says. Instead, Peter gives this speech, this Gnostic speech about the reversal of the world and good and evil being flipped, such that people don't know which way is up and down. And oh, look, I'm symbolically being crucified upside down as a kind of illustration of this point. The whole Peter executed upside down legend because he was too humble to die like Christ, that is from the 4th century. You have to wait another 200 years for that.
Oh, wow. So that's a really late.
very late.
What is the text that you're talking about from the late 2nd century?
I am talking about, so the martyrdom of Peter is contained as part of the Acts of Peter, but there are actually 20 different versions of the martyrdom accounts of Peter and Paul that are out there, and they're collected together and translated in English now. OUP did an edition a while ago. So there are a lot of different versions of this story, and none of them are written within 100 years of the actual deaths of those two people.
Interesting. Now, what about the other early church fathers like Polycarp? What do scholars think about those? Are these legit deaths, or are also legendary?
Well, I think, so I should tell you that there used to be thousands of martyrs whose deaths were placed in the 1st and 2nd century, thousands of them. And there was an organization of actual priests who spent a lot of their time trying to these people did not exist. We need to it's embarrassing. We need to get them out of our tradition. And so they did that over the course of 300 years. Now, someone like Polycarp was one of the martyrs that they think actually existed. We have evidence. There's a letter attributed to him. He's referenced in a bunch of other texts. So he existed. I'm sure that he did die. The story that we have, on the other hand, I personally think that wasn't written down the text that we have was composed about 50 years later. And the text portrays Polycarp as dying like Christ. And I mean, what are the chances that one of the leading figures in the death of Polycarp would also be named Herod? Feels like a little too good to be true. The text is hitting you over the head with these sort of miraculous events that make Polycarp sound like Jesus. They seem historically implausible to anyone with a modicum of sense. This doesn't mean he didn't die. It just means that we just don't know. And sorry, you probably have to be okay with that if you're going to read the story.
Now, I want to back up to what you said about there being thousands of these, and the church started to. What were you saying? They erased them, and they just decided that these don't make sense historically. So what was that like?
So when they started the Société des Bollandistes, as it's known, it started 17th century under a man called Jean Bollandus, and basically they were Luther kind of has a point. We have a lot of martyrs. Some of these people clearly aren't real. There are some martyrs out there that weren't even human beings. There was a medieval martyr who was very popular, and his story looks alarmingly like the story of the Buddha. Great story, not a real person. There wasn't a Christian martyr who was basically the Buddha. And these stories thrived in little local communities because they're often tied to a local legend. The saint is from that region, or they died there, something like that. And so they start kind of chipping away at these stories. And so they traveled around, and they were sort of tell me your story. And then they would say, that's a dog. You're talking about a dog, So, and so they would decide which were just really improbable. And they pulled out hundreds of these. And then they basically whittled it down to a kind of small corpus of, I'm going to say, 30-something stories that they thought were written before Constantine. And you can go read those in English translation. But there are a lot of stories out there because martyr stories are like mushrooms. You go away and you come back and the room was dark and suddenly you have a whole lot of mushrooms. And that's what happens with martyrdom stories, that there's something happens and then the stories just multiply. So there are martyrdom stories for the jailers of Peter and Paul. So bear in mind, we don't really have an actual story for Peter and Paul for 100 years. That story multiplies 20 times. And then someone invents a story that the jailers of Peter and Paul converted to Christianity, were baptized in the prison, and they end up dying like martyrs. And no one really had a problem with writing these kinds of stories. It's us.
So it's sort of like a genre. It's sort of like a way of making culture I when you said that they're linked to local towns, I thought of one that I read before about Saint Demetrius of Thessalonica. And this particular, he's a martyr as well. I don't know. I don't see how he died, but he was only 35. But apparently the goddess Demeter, I'm trying to find what text this is. The source is Clough 2010. It just says that Demetrius was inherited his role from the pagan goddess Demeter after the demise of the Eleusinian mysteries. Demeter is called in the 4th century. The Greek rural population had gradually transferred her rights and roles onto Saint Demetrius. And I'm just thinking, if that's true, it almost makes sense that because there's this location where this famous religion, Eleusinian mysteries, is taking place, and what better way to sort of bring them into the fold of Christianity than to say, yeah, by the way, Saint Demetrius is your link to us, you know?
Yeah, the Eleusinian mysteries were really hard to shut down. So, having a Christian version of the Eleusinian mysteries, you could see why that's persuasive. Although, if you believe Brian Moresco, who wrote this book called The Immortality Key, there were substances in the rituals that, it feels like Christianity couldn't quite compete with. So, hallucinogenics and stuff. But when you think about these, I should say Brian's my friend. I think the book is really good. When you think about these kind of local martyrs and these stories, you could see that they were just sort of comforting to people. Often they're associated with local trade, and they did good business for those communities. People would come. There's a martyr. There's a lamp you can buy. There's a T-shirt. It's like going to a rock concert, and you're like, oh, maybe I'll grab a T-shirt while I'm here. So this was good business for people. And a lot of people liked it. They couldn't afford to travel to the Holy Land. They could go to this local shrine. They could ask their saint for healing. I think anyone who has ever experienced grief or friendship understands the allure of these stories. That just doesn't mean that they're historically accurate.
Yeah, and my last question was about, I wanted to ask, is it common for the Christians to convert pagan places into Christian, and do what are some prime examples of that, if you can think of any?
Yeah, no, it's super common. And if you go visit Italy today and you take sort of a more kind of archaeological tour, everywhere you go that there's some huge church, you will learn that there is a Greek temple there before. So I was just in Sicily, and I was in Syracuse, which was once the capital of Sicily. It was the capital during the Greek period, during the Roman period. There were a lot of beautiful Greek and Roman temples there, all of which were converted into churches. So it's very common for Christians, once they have power, to take over religious sites. And this is kind of double duty for them. On the one hand, now you've made it Christian, those pagans have nowhere to go. On the other hand, people who do come there, who are used to going there, are going to now participate in Christian rituals instead. And so even though from the archaeologist in me is like, oh, can we get that back? If you think of I don't know if you've been to Rome, there's a famous church there called San Clemente. It's right by the Colosseum. And that's built on a Mithraeum.
Yeah.
On top of the cult of Mithras. And when you go, you can go down there.
I think Serapis is down there too, the god Serapis, right?
Yes. And you can go there and you can see it. And that's amazing that they allow you to do that. And kudos to the archaeologists and to the church for allowing people to do that. So there definitely is a deliberate appropriation of holy sites on the part of Christianity. And if it's not, they are, of course, trying to erase paganism, but at the same time, they're trying to co-opt popular sites and the kind of mystery associated with them for Christianity.
Makes sense. That to me makes a lot of sense. Like, why wouldn't you want to, bring people into the fold and have them feel like their sacred place is still a part of the culture? Makes sense. Yeah. So the course, the conference that's coming up, just want to remind everybody, New Insights into the New Testament. And just real quick, you're doing your own segment there. What is that going to be on?
So my talk is about who is Jesus's family actually, and I think this really matters to people. They want to know, like they read the Da Vinci Code. They want to know if he has offspring. They want to know if he has siblings. They want to know who his father is, because we all know the God story, but like who was his father? And it's not as obvious as you would think. And what I kind of want to get into is a thing people don't normally talk about, which is why were people so hung up on this? Like, especially siblings. Why does it matter so much that Jesus didn't have siblings? And there's like a modern reason, but there's an ancient reason, which I think is even cooler, that I don't want to ruin it.
Is there any truth to the Celsus Talmud story about Pantera? If that's is that going to be in your part?
It's going to be in my talk. I'm definitely talking about Pantera. And I'm going to say there's a reason. Celsus has a good reason to think that. Let's just say that. A good historical reason. Not Pantera specifically, but he has a good reason to tell a story like this. You'll see.
Interesting. I can't wait to watch it then. I'm definitely going to sign up. That's a good cliffhanger to leave on. So I think we'll leave it there. Links are in the description. Thanks for your time, and you have just attained true Gnosis. Thank you for watching. Leave a like and a comment and share this video to your friends. However, I want to say something real quick. That last cliffhanger that we left you on about the possible father of Jesus historically, if you want to know more about that and you want to hear more from Candida Moss on this subject, sign up for the conference. The link is in the description. Not only will Candida Moss be there to tell us more about the family of Jesus, but there are tons of other academics like Robyn Walsh, Mark Goodacre, James Tabor, Dr. Allison, Dr. Amy Jo Levine, and plenty of others, led by Dr. Bart Ehrman. I will be there, and by using the link in the description, you're helping out Gnostic Informant. You have attained true Gnosis.